Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Greatest Games podcast on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me is Jonathan Wilson. With us today is Mike Keegan, sports news correspondent at the Daily Mail and author of This Is How It Feels, one of the great untold football miracles of all time. Mike, pleasure to have you on the pod.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Today we go back to November 1989 for the League Cup fourth round tie that ended Oldham 3, Arsenal 1. Mike, why have you chosen this game?
Well, I wrote a book, as you kindly mentioned, that came out recently, and it's about the amazing two seasons, 89, 90 and 90, 91, when Joe Royle took Oldham to heights that we didn't dream possible. And this was the first game, the Arsenal game, that we knew at the start of the season we had a decent team. And then Arsenal, who were the champions of England at the time, following I think it was the Anfield Michael Thomas game, just earlier that year. And they rock up and they get absolutely, spoiler alert, they get absolutely blasted off the plastic. And it's just, when that happened, it's like, wow, like we thought we had a decent team, but in Oldham's history, there was a great line in, that I've shamelessly nicked in the book. I think it was in The Guardian in the match report that said they've waited for, 60 odd years to beat top flight opposition, and they did that last night. And I think he said the Pennines fairly shook. And that was, I was a kid. I mean, I'm 43 now. I was 11 at the time. And I can just remember from that night the incredible atmosphere and the feeling that, wow, our little team have just taken the best team in England to the cleaners.
Yeah, that is important. I mean, 66 years, I read the same report when I was researching this. And because one can think sometimes when talking about what we've come to know as sort of a football league clubs, you haven't been in the top flight for a while, you think, oh, but we're Oldham good back in those days. Do you know what I mean? But Jonathan, that is important because Oldham were not a fancied team. They've never won a major trophy in their history. I mean, they came close in 1915, just a point behind Everton, but they haven't. So this was, as Mike's book testifies to, just an outstanding season.
Yeah, and I mean, again, Mike mentions this incident, but I was at the game. It was Sunderland's final league game of the season. I think Oldham played one more because they'd had so many games delayed because they had these great runs in the League Cup and the FA Cup. But the final league game, and Sunderland were guaranteed to be sixth, but we wanted to win to get an easier draw in the playoffs. Didn't want to have to play Newcastle, although actually it turned out fine. The beating Newcastle bit turned out fine. Other things became slightly more complex. And Oldham had sort of they were knackered by the end of that season. They lost like 6 out of 8 through the April, so they weren't in the promotion picture anymore. But Oldham beat Sunderland 3-2. I remember Roger Palmer scoring a header, and Sunderland were never really in that game. 3-2 flattered Sunderland. And I remember I was standing with my dad on the Roker end, probably about 15 yards from the Oldham fans. And at the final whistle, final game of the season, so there was often a pitch invasion. And suddenly it becomes apparent that Sunderland fans are sort of walking across the pitch towards that corner of the Roker end where the Oldham fans were. And me and my dad were both sort of like, this looks like it might go off. We better get out of here. But it's just too many people there. We can't get out. So we were very, very anxious. And Sunderland fans, this sort of very slow sort of encroachment stops about 10 yards short of the Oldham fans. And Mike, you say in the book that Oldham fans themselves were nervous about this because what's going on? And they just stop and they just sort of start applauding because Oldham had such a great season. They got to the League Cup final. They took Manchester United to replay in the FA Cup semi-final. They'd beaten Arsenal and Everton. They beat Southampton, West Ham. They'd beaten top flight sides. And there was a sense then that it was just a desperate shame that they'd gone out of that season having won nothing. And then fortunately, the next season, they were able to maintain that momentum and get the promotion. But I've never seen that before certainly Sunderland fans, but I think any fans going over to an away set of fans to applaud the fans. What a great season they've had.
I spoke to Neil Adams, who scored one of the other goals in that game, and he remembered it as well. And he said, because the players were still on when the Sunderland fans came onto the pitch, and at first he's thinking, this is 1990. We're not a million miles away from the peak hooligan years. And it's like, this isn't great. And the Sunderland fans just wanted to shake his hand. And I think that's the valid point. It was, Joe Royle tells a great story. He was at the Manager of the Year Awards at the end of the season, and he didn't win, which I find bizarre given what he'd achieved.
Who did win?
I have to look at, somebody else asked me that. I can imagine it would either be Kenny Dalglish or Ferguson, maybe, because he'd won United's first trophy. But he knew that he wasn't going to win. But halfway through the evening, Brian Moore, who commentated on some of the games that season, basically refers to this team in blue that had warmed the nation throughout the winter months, and the highlights start showing on the screen, and Joe realizes, and he got a standing ovation for that. And he kind of twigged, that was the importance of it. Everybody outside Oldham, kind of took them in as the second team. And yeah, he had a lump in his throat after that. And it does. And we said previously, the number of people that you speak to of a certain age, probably 40 or above, remember that team for that glorious season. And the Sunderland supporters, I mean, I've always had a soft spot for Sunderland because of that afternoon. And this will probably sound condescending, and it really doesn't, I don't intend it that way, but you think of proper football fans and you think Sunderland, what they've been through, the crowds that they still get, like, those are proper football fans. And they realised what they'd seen was great. And to do that was something that we'd not seen before.
Yeah, researching this side, it seems to be, as you say, and you've mapped out there, that this Oldham side, when people talk about particular teams going cup runs, they were everybody's second favourite team. Like, this was absolutely undisputed this season under Joe Royle. But even the media seemed very, very surprised and shocked. How did the media kind of focus on them? Was it the usual tropes of, oh, well, they're a bit luckier or tough to beat and so on? But as the season progressed, perhaps more respect was gained.
There was a split. I spent a lot of time near Wetherby at the British Library going through the Nationals and their coverage of it. There was still a lot of reporters who I presume were not from the Northern Patch, who were quite snooty about it, who put a lot of the success down to the plastic pitch, which was a valid point. There's a chap, Stuart Jones, who I took from it. I think it was in the Times, and they beat Villa, who were top of the first division at the time in the FA Cup quarter final, 3-0, destroyed them. So it was very similar to the Arsenal game. And he basically had a right whinge in the Times. So it's a disgrace. These football matches should not be played on these surfaces. But then the ones who were regulars, and Joe, I spoke to John Richardson, a veteran reporter who was around at the time, who's still going now, Rico. And Rico said that he would do a lot of Newcastle games. And he'd do a lot of Oldham games. I think he lived in Chester, and he'd be back earlier to Chester from the Newcastle games than the Oldham games, because Joe had this thing where he valued the press. He realised that you needed to get them on side. So after the games, they'd often end up in his office, a few cans of beer and they'd be in there for hours. So it's quite clear when you're reading the reports who was part of that pack and who wasn't. Yeah.
I mean,
is there a sense as well? Sorry, is there a sense as well that the plastic, it had this sort of reputation, this aura, and so Oldham could use that to intimidate opponents? Because you have the Southampton game, which is the round after this, the fifth round of the League Cup, when they get the last minute equaliser, and Joe Royle turning to the Southampton bench and going, back on the plastic.
Yeah,
that it was a sort of sense
plastic.
of, yeah. It was something that whether it was fair or not, it was something opposing teams were concerned by.
Yeah, and they used to ham it up. They play on it. There's some great stuff. So Andy Barlow was the left back who was from Oldham. So he, on the Friday afternoons, he would stay behind because he'd be the one who would always go into the schools and do presentations for kids and all that kind of stuff. So on the Fridays before a home game, the away team would turn up because part of the rules were they were allowed to train on the pitch so they could get used to it. So Barlow would wait for them in the main stand. He'd come down and he'd see, usually there'd be about 20 different pairs of shoes at the side of the pitch, different trainers and different studs, and he'd come down as the friendly professional and he'd be like, oh lads, those that you're wearing, and he would intentionally go to the most inappropriate footwear in the pile and he'd be like, these are what you need to wear. And they were, and Ian Marshall tells a great story. I think it was Port Vale that they were playing. And there was such this mystique about the pitch and what you could and couldn't wear. And he looked down in the tunnel and one of the Port Vale players was wearing a pair of Dunlop Green Flash, the former fire service plimsolls, and he knew then that we're going to be all right today. And Rick Holden came up with a great line. I think it was for it was either Everton or West Ham in the same cup run. And he said before the game that they'll be like dogs sliding around on lino. And that was exactly as it played out. So they certainly used it to their own advantage. Rick said before the Arsenal game, he went up to the main stand to watch their training session, and he could see they had a walkthrough, and George Graham had basically banned them from playing any long balls because there was this view that if you play a long ball, it's just going to bounce off the turf and it's just going to go out, which was a nonsense because it was actually quite a true bounce. So they really did use that to their own advantage.
Yeah, see, I find this funny because nowadays, you fast forward a bit. I know artificial surfaces have changed quite a lot, but a passing side, a more so-called cultured side, would want a more artificial surface. They want, the team who is perhaps looked down upon or whatever for being uncultured, presumably want to play in a kind of farmer's field, that kind of thing. But what was the style of play under Joe Royle? Because it wasn't just the results and the kind of the character of the side and the team spirit. Was it, as I understand it, the style of play was quite attractive to the neutral?
Yeah, he would adapt quite a lot. So, obviously we can talk about it with the Arsenal game, but he started the season in a 4-4-2, and it was kind of fullbacks had to be rapid. So they had Dennis Irwin on one side, who was very quick, Andy Barlow on the other side. His midfield two, Milligan and Henry, would basically get the ball, give it to someone who can play. And then his wingers, Rick Holden, Neil Adams, could get crosses in. And he's two up front. Frankie Bunn was kind of the target man, and Andy Ritchie was there to finish it off. But he switched for the Arsenal game and played three up front to give them more to think about. There's a great comment from Sir Alex Ferguson when they played United at Main Road in the FA Cup semi-final. So they draw 3-3 and then they lose 2-1. And when it got to 2-1, when they pulled it back to 1-1 in the replay, instead of just settling for a replay, Joe was like, the last thing in the world this football club needs is another game this season, because I think they ended up playing 65. So Andy Holden, the centre half, had gone to play up front. And as the equaliser went in, he looked over to the bench and said to Joe, "Do I go back now?" And Joe said, "No, stay up there." And as things transpired, Mark Robbins went through a giant Andy Holden-sized hole and scored the winner. And Joe regrets that. He said, what was another game? And, we didn't get promoted. I kind of knew at the time we were running out of energy. He should have come back. But then Alex Ferguson, after the game, the press saying, what are your thoughts on Oldham? And he says, they are the best team that we've played this season. So the press kind of do a double take, and it's like, well, hang on a minute. Liverpool are in their peak at the time. I think they'd already won the title. Do you include Liverpool? And Alex Ferguson said, they have just played against us, Manchester United, with one centre half in a semi-final. Do you think Liverpool would ever do that? So it was just bold. It was very attacking. And as you said, the plastic came into it. Joe's moan, because the home form was dreadful that season. So the away form was dreadful. They only won 2 games on the road. And Joe would say the reason we don't win on the road is because the pitches are so bad. So when they go to Old Trafford, Main Road and play United, it's that time of year where the pitch is in amazing condition and they can play on that. But yeah, they struggled on quagmires, and as the weather turned, then they really did struggle away from
Which is
home.
a weird thing about the complaints about plastic pitches. I get there's a health and safety issue with kind of impact on knees and whatever, but it clearly is a better surface than some of a rutted bog. And yet we were happy with bogs, but somehow plastic was seen as being...
Which is why I find it so odd that some people are a bit snooty towards them, because you'd think it'd be the other way around.
Yeah,
and they say,
I guess it's just because it's artificial.
It's different. I think it's what it was. It was different, and that was.
But just on this point of a number of games they played, I love that story you tell in the book about the Simod Cup game that year, the game when Nick Henry sort of makes his breakthrough. So go on, tell us that story.
Yeah, I think it might have been the season before.
Oh, was it?
Sorry. Nick Henry was. Joe said that he had old man's legs, which meant that he kind of ran from side to side too much. And he tried to get him in at Chester, he tried to get him in at Stockport. And because he was a great kid, he'd come from Liverpool, he was getting 2 buses every day just to come into training. And they played Middlesbrough, I think it was called the Simod Cup, or I think that merged into Zenith Data Systems, Fairs Cup originally. and he just didn't want to play against him because they were playing at Ipswich on the Friday. So he phoned Bruce Rioch and said, Bruce, can we move this game from Wednesday to Tuesday? Because I could do with an extra day to prepare for the Ipswich game. And Bruce Rioch's response was, and they were friends, the pair of them. Joe, Middlesbrough Football Club plays its midweek games on a Wednesday. And Joe's like, well, I know that, but we've got Ipswich on Friday. Is there any chance to bring it forward? Joe, Middlesbrough Football Club plays its midweek games on a Wednesday. So he says, oh, great. So he sticks Henry in midfield. Oldham are losing 1-0 and they're delighted about this because they just want to be out of this competition. And all of a sudden, Henry starts playing like, I don't know, reincarnation of, I don't know, Alan Ball, and just winning the ball left, right and centre and man possessed. And it's looking like Oldham are going to score an equaliser. So Joe turns to his physio, Ian Liversidge, the sauce, and says, right, take the two forwards off. So is that right, boss? And who's coming on? He says, nobody. So Liversidge starts laughing. He's like, I'm not sure you can do that, boss. He said, well, there's no rules that I've ever seen that say you can't. So they hold up the two numbers, the two players come running off, and the ref's like, who's coming on, Joe? Joe's like, nobody. So they call it the non-substitution substitutions. So they take the two off, they end up with 9 men, they lose 1-0, and Bruce Rioch goes crazy after the game. It's like they disrespected the competition. And Joe's response was, well, I told you we didn't want to be in the effing competition. And that was Nick Henry then plays, as we'll talk about, a key role in the Arsenal game, but he should have been nowhere near not only Oldham football by that stage.
I love that story you told as well about when he first arrived. He was his landlady kept loads of cats and he had a cat allergy, so he was desperately struggling, kind of, because his cats kept on stealing into his bed. Yeah.
He'd get home from a long day training and he'd pull the covers back and there'd be a cat in his bed. He went from there. He's from Dingle in Liverpool, so you would imagine he'd be quite used to kind of a working class environment. But I think even the parts of Oldham that he ended up in opened his eyes. And then he went with a very religious family. So if he ever pulled up in training or had like an ankle niggle, then the family would all gather around the table and say prayers for Nick's injury. So sounded like quite an interesting time off the field.
My goodness. All right, chaps, let's have a quick break and then we'll talk about the match against Arsenal. See you in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the greatest games on the Blizzard. So then, to the match. As you mentioned earlier, Mike, Arsenal were the top flight champions, turning up, of course, to Boundary Park. And you say that this was the first moment then that everybody sat up and took note of Oldham?
I think so. They played Leeds in the first round, and Leeds were we played Leeds a lot at the time, and Joe Royle had pilfered Leeds because Billy Bremner was there, and he it was criminal really, but Bremner oversaw the dismantling of this amazing youth setup that Eddie Gray had set up before he arrived. So we'd taken the likes of Dennis Irwin, Andy Linnigan, Tommy Wright, people like that off them. And we would routinely beat Leeds, even though they were the favourites for the second division that year. So we beat them over 2 legs, both home and away. And then we played Scarborough in the previous round. And to be fair, Scarborough had beaten Chelsea, which was unheard of, over 2 legs. So there was a little bit nervous about that. And we beat Scarborough 7-0. And obviously Frankie Bunn got 6 of the goals, which I think still stands as the tournament record today. So it was we knew that we were onto a good thing. We knew that we had a good team, but the champions of England come to town and it's, now's the test. Like, how good are we? And I don't think anybody foresaw what came after that.
Yeah. And that transfer strategy that Joe Royle took, Jonathan, to kind of, as it was said, sort of raid the reserve teams of Leeds and Everton and those kind of places, pay dividends, of course, and some of the names in that side, Dennis Irwin being one that I'm sure people would remember. I quite like that. Was Paul Warhurst used as a centre half? Because for me, I remember more Paul Warhurst when he was at Sheffield Wednesday, when he was played a bit further forward.
But that was an emergency thing at Sheffield Wednesday. He got shifted up front. Was David Hurst was injured, I think,
possibly.
And so they shoved Warhurst forward. He suddenly gets 12 and 12 and gets a call up.
Yeah, but does that, I suppose, feed in, Mike, to the attacking flair of this side that they had players who were all willing to get involved in the attack?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the defenders scored goals that season. Warhurst was quite an interesting one because Joe had already been to City and taken Earl Barrett for £35,000. And they ended up selling Barrett, I think 1.7 million, and he paid for a stand that he still joked should be named after him. But Earl, I mean, this is the sadness, I suppose, and the changing of the times. Earl had played for City's first team. He was only young. He was lightning quick. He was quite highly rated, but for whatever reason, Mel Machin just didn't fancy him. Now, Oldham were able to pay Earl more money to come and play for Oldham than he was on at Manchester City. I mean, can you imagine now if Oldham went to get a kid out of City's reserves who played for the first team, he'd be on 45, 50 grand a week. So he'd been and he got Earl, and City were kicking themselves about it because immediately it became clear that they dropped a massive one there. So he goes back to watch the reserves, and he's talking to Machin, and he asks him, what about the kid Warist? And Machin says, Mel, he said, Joe, he said, he's driving us mad. He's always injured. He says, well, he's going on a free tomorrow. So Joe said, right, well, we'll take him. So Machin goes to tell Peter Swales, who I'm sure people remember, the City chairman, and Swales says, if it's them, we want 10 grand. So Machin has to speak to Joe Royle, and he's like, I'm really sorry, it's a bit embarrassing, but the chairman said if he's anywhere else, he's free, but if he's going to you, you're going to have to give us 10 grand. So Royle speaks to his chairman, Ian Stott, and says, we'll make money on this, which were the magic words that would always open the checkbook. And he gives him the green light, and they sign Warist. And Peter Swales is absolutely delighted that they've managed to take 10,000 off Oldham for this kid that's never going to make it. And Swales tells the rest of his board, from now on, they're going to call Warist Barrett's Revenge, because they finally got the revenge for Barrett. So Warist comes in, and I think he ended up going for about 800 grand to Sheffield Wednesday and played for England. So it's like, yeah. And City came in for Joe after the Arsenal game. And again, this is ludicrous. You know, Manchester City coming for the Oldham manager. He turned them down. Like the Oldham manager turning down Manchester City. And when he told Swales, he said, he was disappointed, and as he's going to leave, he said, just one last thing, Joe. Is there anyone else in our reserves that you like the look of? And Joe just started laughing. I'm not telling you. So that was, but yeah, going back, they're all quick. They're all enterprising, and yeah, they all got for. Earl Barrett scored a few goals that season. Dennis Irwin, didn't really see it as much at United, because they had some great players there, but Dennis used to take the free kicks, and he was lethal from the edge of the box.
Yeah. And to the match itself, Jonathan, I mean, looking at sort of highlights on YouTube and so on, it just seemed straight from the off, Oldham were on the front foot, which I suppose the fans came to expect that season. But again, they were playing the champions of England.
Yeah, in that first half, I guess the worry would be, from the Oldham point of view, that they hadn't scored. They were so much on top. They should have had a penalty. I mean, that's clearly a foul by Adams on Bunn that doesn't get given. He goes through him from behind. There's a long-range effort from Irwin that's saved well down by to his left by Lukic. Marshall nearly gets on an Irwin cross at the back post. Yeah, they absolutely batter them. And then it's only in the last minute of the half when they finally get the breakthrough, which is a deep cross from Barlow to Ritchie, who takes it down, slams it back across Lukic into the far corner.
Great finish.
Oh, really good finish. Yeah.
Yeah, and how important was Mike Ritchie to the side, Mike?
Oh, Ritchie was incredible. I was actually sat behind where he was when he chested that down. So, and it's one of the few things that I can still remember now, seeing him chest it down, and as he hit it, we were right behind the trajectory of it. It doesn't really come across on the footage now, but it actually curled. It sets off going outside and curls and just goes. And as soon as it started coming in, I remember just as a kid sitting there thinking, my God, that's going in. And it went in, and it was absolute bedlam. And I think that was probably Ritchie's best game. I mean, there are so many, but there's a bit projecting ahead, but for the third goal, he just glides past an Arsenal defender as though he's not there, outside of the foot out wide, continues his run. It's, this is a guy, and I don't think it would happen now because I think of all the analysis that we have and all the scouts involved. I don't think a player as talented as Ritchie would end up at a club like Oldham, a championship club, because he'd come through the ranks at United. He scored a couple of hat-tricks for United. For whatever reason, his face doesn't fit. A load of clubs came in from. He ended up at Brighton, bizarrely, because he got on with Alan Mullery. And then he comes back to Leeds, and it's just every time he played Leeds, you knew Andy Ritchie, great player. And for whatever reason, his face doesn't fit. He ends up at Oldham. And I don't think in this day and age, you would see a player as good as that. I think he was out of place with us, as daft as that sounds. He should have been playing in the first division.
Yeah, but and another sign of the times, this season is just really does put it into contrast just how different football was back then, and it wasn't that long ago, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things. But in the match, Jonathan, 1-0 at half time, and in the second half starts, and Arsenal are then on the front.
Yeah, they clearly have kind of had a rocket at half time, and they're far more attacking. And Andy Rhodes makes 2 really good saves. I mean, I have to say, I was sort of slightly baffled when I found the highlights for this, because I remember the semi-final when it was Hallworth in goal. And I was sort of, well, hang on, where's that thin ginger lad gone? But, they had 2 very good keepers, because Rhodes makes 2 very good saves early in the half. Mm-hmm. First one at Michael Thomas's feet, and then it maybe makes the most of that. But, it looks really exciting when you first see it.
He also makes a great save from Niall Quinn, and it was nice to see a goalkeeper, in the context of that, back in the day, playing for Oldham, doing these kind of more continental style saves, and I thought, it was a bit of flair, on show for the fans,
My favourite bit. Sorry, go on. My favourite bit of that with Rhodes is, I can't remember which one it is, but it's one of the particularly athletic saves that he makes where he could have actually just caught it, really. Yeah. And as he lands, the camera zooms in on him, and he looks like he's got like a full tub of Brill cream on his head, and he just pats the top of his head to make sure his hair's still in place for the cameras.
He was ahead of his time, you could argue.
Yeah.
But Niall Quinn I think he gets better as the game goes on. But the first half, the highlights, there was about sort of 10 minutes of highlights of the first half you can find on YouTube. And Niall Quinn must miscontrol the ball about 5 times in that 10 minutes. And those are the highlights. So God knows what was happening in the rest of the game. So, I was watching it through, hands on my eyes, watching poor Quinny having a shocker. But he does get better as the game goes on.
Yeah, it scores at the end.
Yeah, and a nice goal. So, they're 4 really good goals, actually. The second one from that man, Nick Henry, it was his first senior goal for the club, if I understand it, Mike.
Yeah.
And it's from, 30 yards? All of 30 yards, you'd say. It's an absolute peach right into the corner.
Yeah, and he certainly didn't have a reputation for doing that. Nick was great. I think he's one of the, you speak to him now, and he was brilliant. He gave me loads of his time. I think he's he does like carpet fitting in Scarborough now. And he was just really, really generous. And he was very open about it. He said when he was a kid in Liverpool, he used to play up front, and he scored loads and loads of goals. But then by the time he gets to Oldham, they try and knock that out of him. And Joe Royle there's a great quote following the final whistle. He said when he got the ball, because there's a free kick, I think Irwin smashes it into the wall and it gets cleared to Henry and takes a touch. And everyone in the ground's basically saying shoot, apart from Joe Royle, who's screaming at him from the bench, telling him to pass it. He said, and then he says when he hits it, he almost ducked because he does that in training and it goes anywhere. Yeah. And Henry himself said, he's thinking, I really should pass this, but now I'm going to have a dig. And as he hits it, he says, he's just thinking, just hit the target. If you hit the target, he can't have a go at you. And it flies into the bottom corner, and there's not a keeper in the world that would have saved it. And I think the celebration afterwards, there's a great clip where Milligan gets him in a headlock. And then once he frees himself from Milligan, you just look at, he's a kid at the time, he's this youthful exuberance, and he's just laughing his head off. Even he doesn't believe that it's just, where did that come from?
Well, perhaps that was out of necessity, because, in a previous game, he looks up and he thinks, well, there's no one to pass to because the 2 forwards are off. Right, well, I'm going to have to learn maybe to shoot from 30 yards.
Maybe that
was it. Oh, it was a great goal. And then, on to the third goal, Jonathan.
Which is an even better goal. Different type of goal, but
you really are sport for choice, because I was trying to figure out which is the best goal, but it probably would be this one. You would say
it's just the inter-movements. It's just a brilliant break, and the point Mike made earlier about the pace in the team. That Milligan wins it. It's worked to Richie. Richie just sort of drifts past Nigel Winterburn, and then there's Irwin bombing down the outside. You had 2-0 up with quarter of an hour to go, and there's your fullback making this overlapping run. Plays it to Irwin. Carries on his run at the box, and then sort of somehow contorts his body to get onto the cross and heads it in. It's a really, really good goal. Just the fluency of it, the ambition of it, the sort of no sense of holding possession, keeping things tight, running down the clock. like, let's get the third. And it's it's a beautiful goal. And it takes all the pressure off. Yeah, they're never going to score 3 in the last 15 minutes, whereas they might have got 2.
Yeah. And once that goes in, it's like, wow, like this is done. And it's not, I talk about them redefining the act of giant killing in the book. You think of giant killing even now, and it's like you grab a goal against a run of play and then you hold on for 90 minutes. Like this was giant killing, but of a different type. Like this was, an absolute pasting. And there's a great clip. So if you watch it back when the cross comes in and Richie heads it in, that's in front of the Arsenal fans who'd had a miserable night. It was November in Oldham, ice station zebra. They're on the open terrace behind the goal. I think it had rained all night. And there's one Arsenal fan in like a yellow raincoat, I think, who just starts jumping up and down and celebrating. And it's just like, we've just given up. Like, let's just have a laugh. And that was it. And it's just, at that point, I think you start to realize, wow, like that's the league champions. And this could be anything. We put 7 on Scarborough. How many are we going to get now? I mean, it didn't turn out like that, but you'd take 3-1 every day of the week.
Yeah. But again, just to remind everybody, it'd been 66 years since Oldham had beaten a team from the top flight and they were the champions. And the manner of the goals and the performance, for the neutrals and for those who didn't know what was going on, it just came out of nowhere for a lot of people, which was just something extraordinary. And Joe, Roy, you said at the start that people thought Oldham had a decent side. What were the expectations of this season? I mean, I know cup runs are a funny thing, but was promotion the actual? I suppose it would be. The league is always your priority, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there were about 33-1 to come up. So Joe had arrived in 82, and they actually had a good team when he first arrived, and he finished 7th in his first season in Division 2. But then he had to sell reality bit, and he had to sell all his best players, and they only.
That story about how he gets the job is a great story. So you might as well tell that about being on the hard shoulder and the lorry.
Yeah. So he just packed in at Norwich. His knee had gone. He was only 32. He'd applied for a couple of jobs in Division 4, I think Peterborough and Blackpool, and they both turned him down. And it was actually Martin O'Neill, who was playing alongside him at Norwich. They'd gone on an end of season trip to Jamaica, and they're by the pool, and it's in the Daily Mirror that Oldham have sacked Jimmy Frizzell, the previous manager. And Martin O'Neill says, who obviously, goes on to be an amazing manager himself, says to Joe, why don't you apply for that? And Joe's thinking, well, I've been binned off by 2 Division 4 clubs, but yeah, I'll give it a try. Joe doesn't realise how strapped for cash they are until he finds out that John Weil apparently was going to be given the job, but he wanted a Volvo, and they refused to give him this Volvo. And they'd advertised for a player manager, and he quickly twigged the reason they wanted a player manager was because they could bring him in and then immediately sell one of the players in that position that the manager played. So his knee's gone, but he thinks by the time they find out the knee's gone, it's all right, they're not going to sack me. And he goes for a first interview, which goes well. He stays overnight at his mum's house in Maghull, in Merseyside. He's driving, he gets called back for what he thinks is a second interview, and he's on the M62 in his Jaguar coupe, and the engine goes. So he's on the hard shoulder and he's thinking, this isn't great. They're not going to be happy with this. So he has to stick his thumb out for a lift. And obviously this is a guy who played for Everton in England. And it's the motorway that links Liverpool with Hull. So a Scouse lorry driver spots him at the side of the road, does a double take and pulls over for him, jumps into the cab of this lorry, and he takes him to Boundary Park. And when he gets there, I think he's the only manager in the history to come off the front rather than the back of a lorry. And he gets there and they say, yeah, the job's yours. This isn't a second interview. We want to give you the job. And later that day, he goes into his office and there's 2 strangers in there who he thinks are board members, goes and introduces himself, and they're actually bailiffs sizing up the furniture for an unpaid bill. Welcome to Oldham. But yeah, they had a decent team. He had to sell all his best players, and it quickly, with the assistance of his chairman, because Joe, he said to me, he never played golf, and at the peak of his career, I think he scored 28, 29 goals in a season for Everton. He's playing for England, and he's earning more from buying and selling cars than he is from playing football. And that's, again, another indication of how times have changed. But he used those skills, the buying and selling, transferred it into football, and that was his modus operandi. He'd get the great players in, he would sell them, Andy Gorham, Mickey Quinn, people like that, and then he'd have to bring players in for a lot less. So it's kind of his first rebuild job climaxed in 86, 87 when they finished third in the second division and were the first football club in history to be denied promotion to the top flight because of the playoffs, because it was the first season of the playoffs. And horrendous. I mean, I was only 8 at the time. It still brings me out in tears now, but they lost 1-0 at Leeds in the last minute. They get them back to boundary back. And this is Leeds who finished 9 points below them. They get the goal back. It's 1-1. With about 2 minutes left, they go 2-0 up and everyone's still celebrating. We've done it. The old enemy had been pied off. They had to play Charlton at the time because the team in the first division that was coming down had like a last chance to save itself. And then with the last kick of the game, Leeds go and score an away goal. And that was it. It was disaster, and we got knocked out by Leeds. Bad?
Sunderland got relegated to the third division on away goals against Gillingham that season. So,
so that was that. And then the same thing happens, and he's got to sell his best player. Kevin Moore, who sadly passed away recently, was one that he had to get rid of. Gorham goes, and it's another rebuild. But it's kind of. You'd have done well to pick that Oldham team as one that was going to challenge, because I think they finished either 16th or 17th the previous season. They were very streaky. And Joe says that there was a game at Bournemouth not long after he'd signed Frankie Bunn, and it was the first time Bunn and Richie had played together. And it was unspectacular to the naked eye. They drew 2-2. But on the coach on the way back from that game, he said he smiled all the way back from Bournemouth back to Oldham, because obviously he was a striker himself. And he saw that partnership between Bunn and Richie, and he thought, we've got a real chance here with these two. So I think while they finished 16th the previous season, they'd only lost 4 of the last 25 games. So if you were smart and if you were an Oldham fan, you probably would have been quite confident, but certainly nobody outside Oldham expected what happened.
Yeah, incredible. Did Joe Royle, did he receive a letter of congratulations from the Prime Minister at the end of the season? Or am I dreaming? Have I misread that somewhere?
I'm not sure.
Somebody from number 10.
He may have done. I know he got a Rolex from the club.
Yeah, well, arguably better.
He actually showed me that last Friday when I got the first couple of copies of the book, and obviously Joe was one of the first people that I wanted to give a copy to, and myself, Joe, and a couple of the old directors, Joe's son, who's a friend of mine, went to the local pub and had a nice meal, and he took his Rolex off and showed he still got it, which was nice. And Willie Donachie's number 2 had come from the Gorbals in Glasgow, and incredibly rough upbringing. And Willie had never even owned a stopwatch. And then at the end of that season, he walks off with a Rolex.
Super. Absolutely superb. Mike, it's been a pleasure talking to you about Oldham in what Joe Royle called the pinch me season, of course, with that amazing win against Arsenal and cup runs and so on and so forth there. So yeah, just to remind everybody, of course, Mike's book is called This Is How It Feels, and it's well worth a read. But a pleasure having you on the pod, Mike. Thanks very much.
No, my pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Marcus, Jonathan.
Nice one. For more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk. Until next week, Jonathan and I will be back with another great game from football. See you then.